One day, the Demon King fought a fierce battle against the hero. They both launched attacks at each other until they finally stabbed each other and fell together. Time quickly passed. At the Hero Academy, a transfer student named Blade arrived with one simple resolve: he wanted to have 100 friends. At the academy, Blade greeted every student he met in a friendly manner. There, he became acquainted with Ernest Flaming, the most influential student, who was nicknamed the Female Emperor. However, after hearing that Blade didn't care at all about the ideal of becoming a hero, Ernest sternly scolded him. In her opinion, Blade was being half-hearted even though many people fought for that dream. When Blade asked for Ernest's help to get to the principal's office, the person they met was no ordinary man, but the king, who was now serving as the school principal. Ernest greeted him with great respect, while Blade remained casual. However, the king dismissed Ernest because he wanted to speak with Blade alone. Even though Blade just wanted to live as an ordinary student and make friends, the king forced him to undergo rehabilitation to restore his hero's power. He even planned to change the academy's curriculum for that purpose. Blade was then asked to attend the advanced class training ground. Ernest suspected that he had used underhanded methods to get into the class because, in her opinion, Blade lacked the resolve of a hero. Blade insisted that he also had a resolve to make 100 friends. This attitude annoyed Ernest even more, and she spontaneously challenged Blade. With forced permission from the instructor, Ernest confronted Blade with reinforced steel armor, challenging him to slash it, a task considered normal for advanced class students. Blade then revealed his hidden power. His fighting spirit surged, and he performed a hero's technique, the dragon sequence. Wind swirled around his sword. The air grew incredibly heavy, and the shockwave tore Ernest's clothes and knocked many people down. Furthermore, the sword he used shattered, astonishing everyone and making them wonder who Blade really was. Nervously, he just replied that he was just an ordinary student. After training, Blade tried to ask Ernest to have lunch together. However, other students were reluctant to join because they were still afraid of him. Ernest retracted her accusation of cheating and even apologized after witnessing Blade's power. It was then that Blade asked her to be his friend. Ernest, who was initially embarrassed, finally accepted with a red face. However, that joy didn't last long because Ernest's sword suddenly went on a rampage, endangering the surroundings. The next day, Ernest participated in sparring practice. During the session, she managed to defeat her opponent. But when it was her turn to fight Blade, she suddenly fainted, forcing Blade to immediately carry her to the infirmary. However, the doctor couldn't help because the problem wasn't a physical injury, but a magical curse. Upon waking, Ernest was terrified and refused to be treated. Blade promised to protect her as a friend. Finally, Blade managed to discover that the curse came from the sword Asmodeus, which granted great power along with a slaughterous desire. Ernest recounted her past. When she was 6 years old, she unknowingly touched that cursed sword and had since continuously suppressed the slaughterous urge from the demon within it. Although she knew how to tame it, she was afraid of losing control and didn't dare to do it. Blade tried to convince Ernest to face the demon in the sword. He promised to help her if she lost control. Ernest then summoned Asmodeus from within the sword. A fire tornado appeared, surrounding her. Confidently, Ernest fought it, accompanied by the belief that Blade was by her side. After a fierce battle, Ernest succeeded in taming the demon and bringing it back under her control. Blade is practicing sparring with his two friends. Suddenly, Ernest arrives and warns Blade to take it seriously and draw his sword immediately. Blade senses something different about Ernest. She now appears more graceful after changing her hairstyle. Returning to her main purpose, Ernest asks Blade to train with Sophie. Sophie asks if this is an order, but Blade clarifies that it is not, he simply wants to help her. Until now, Sophie has only known how to throw punches, so Blade intends to teach her how to use a sword. When attempting to wield the sword, Sophie is instead thrown backward. Blade then advises her to channel her fighting spirit. Surprisingly, Sophie learns quickly and eventually gains control over her sword. She then asks if mastering the sword can help her become equal to Ernest. Blade replies that achieving that won't be so easy. In response, Sophie unexpectedly knocks Blade to the ground, impressing him and earning his praise. As it was getting late, Sophie ended the training session. On another occasion, Blade has a casual conversation with the king. The king asks who his closest friend has been lately, and Blade replies that it is Sophie. The king then reveals a shocking truth: Sophie is the subject of an artificial hero project, intentionally created to surpass Blade's strength. Based on a robust human physique, Sophie was cloned repeatedly until she was successfully born as the 12th creation. Hearing this, Blade becomes angry, not at the king, but at himself. Feeling that his existence is the cause of all this suffering, he resolves to make Sophie's life normal, even though he himself doesn't know what a normal life looks like. After asking around, he finds an answer: people their age usually go on dates. Without further ado, Blade asks Sophie out. In response, Sophie smiles at him and accepts the invitation. Meanwhile, 3 female students, including Ernest, watch them from a distance. Blade has already prepared a date itinerary. Although they are 3 minutes late, they still set off. Sophie even holds hands with Blade, making him nervous. While sitting together, Blade and Sophie drink from the same coconut with 2 straws. When their faces accidentally touch, Blade becomes flustered. Ernest, watching from afar, is filled with jealousy. As evening approaches, their final agenda is to watch the fountain. Sophie wonders why Blade is going through all this trouble for her. Blade replies, because he considers Sophie his friend. Sophie then emphasizes that friends shouldn't hide secrets from each other. Because of this, she reveals her true identity as an experimental subject. Sophie demonstrates her ability to manipulate the laws of physics. Although she can only control it for 10 seconds, she is the only successful clone with the lowest failure rate. Not wanting to hide anything, Blade honestly confesses that he is actually a hero. Although his powers have now disappeared, he admits he hates his destiny. Since childhood, he was always forced to save others and punished when he failed. He feels his existence is the reason Sophie was born. However, Sophie asserts that even if Blade didn't choose that path, he would still be a hero. Sophie then shares her journey of self-discovery after breaking free from the evil organization. Along the way, she heard many stories of people saved by Blade, and her dream was to become like him. Hearing this, Blade becomes determined not to be trapped by his past anymore. Additionally, the 2 promise to keep each other's secrets. Over time, Blade's relationship with his friends grew closer. They often sat together for lunch. However, a sudden, intense tremor occurred. The tremor came from a dragon summoned by the king for student training. Blade arrived with a plate of curry rice. Without much thought, he struck the dragon once, causing its strength to weaken. Realizing the dragon was still a child, Blade gave it his curry rice until it calmed down. This left the students both shocked and frightened by Blade's power. Shortly after, the dragon transformed into a young child who immediately called Blade father. This happened due to a dragon's instinct: they respect those who defeat them. Blade named him Chu, inspired by the name of a loyal and strong knight who always keeps his promises. The next day, Ernest found Blade with the dragon child. Ernest explained that his transformation into a human was a rare evolution where dragons mimic the form of the creature that defeated them to survive. However, since this case was extremely rare, Ernest almost suspected that Blade had defeated it. Blade quickly diverted attention by suggesting that the dragon might have been defeated by someone else. Since then, Chu became an extremely spoiled child. He would only eat if fed by Blade and even got angry when Korea tried to feed him. This happened for a reason: he disliked humans, whom he considered weaker. Chu later wandered around the school and met students who were training. They invited him to join, but Chu outright refused, saying they were no match for Blade. This made Ernest increasingly worried, and she scolded Blade to abandon him. However, Blade refused to leave Chu alone because he knew what it was like to live without parents. Hearing this, Ernest fell silent, as she had also experienced similar loneliness. One night, Blade and Chu gazed at the moon together. Blade realized that Chu actually wanted to make friends, but his dragon nature made him reluctant to acknowledge weaker people. The next day, Blade searched for Chu and found him playing with dolls in his room. Strangely, all the dolls were named after Blade's friends at the academy, even including students whose names Blade himself couldn't remember. Blade realized that Chu truly wanted friends, but his innate dragon nature held him back. Blade felt he had failed because he couldn't understand him. Ernest then scolded Blade for always trying to handle everything alone. She emphasized that Blade should also learn to rely on his friends. Moved by her words, the next day Blade asked the students for help to face Chu together. At first, they were hesitant, but Blade pleaded with them to help make Chu a part of their group. Finally, the students agreed, reasoning that a human dragon is still a social creature. So, if they cooperated and managed to defeat him, Chu would still consider it a victory. Shortly after, the battle against Chu began. The dragon child spewed fire from its mouth, causing the students to panic and scatter. Ernest immediately took command, shouting for everyone to maintain their formation while she launched an attack. Ku was caught off guard as arrows shot through the air towards him, followed by another platoon swinging their swords simultaneously. However, the attack was still not enough to injure his thick scales. Then, Ku began to rampage. Seeing an opportunity, Sophie ran and hit him with her fist. This was followed by a fire attack from Ernest's sword. As a result, all the students were able to attack simultaneously. Ernest's demon sword hesitated in the face of the dragon's power, but Ernest scolded it for being cowardly. Leonard tried to help, but his body was sent flying by the hardness of the dragon's scales. Just as Ku was about to take flight, Ernest stopped him again. Meanwhile, Sophie pressed down with her gravity power. All the students then channeled their power into Ernest's sword. With a full-powered slash, Ku was returned to his human form. For the first time, he acknowledged the students' strength and agreed to be friends with them. A few days later during lunch, something strange suddenly happened. Ernest was eating an incredible amount of food until her body became fat. All the students pretended not to notice to avoid offending her. Blade, however, made a blunt comment that made Ernest cry. Because of Blade, Ernest locked herself in her room for 3 full days. Blade felt guilty but didn't realize what was wrong with what he had said. His 3 friends accompanied him to apologize. They found Ernest hiding in a dark room. They thought she was grieving, but when the lights were turned on, it turned out she was eating voraciously. Blade then asked if she was worried their friendship would end. Ernest, of course, said no. She was just embarrassed by her body. Blade asserted that it didn't change how he saw her. His friends reminded her that the main problem was overeating. They then tried to help Ernest diet, but they always failed because her appetite didn't diminish. As a last resort, Ernest chose to train with Blade. She commanded the demon sword to absorb the energy in her body so that her fat could be reduced. Fire enveloped Ernest's body, giving her the form of her first ancestor, Asmodeus. Asmodeus then asked which enemy was to be destroyed. Ernest answered, the fat, as she intended to use her demonic power only to burn calories. Asmodeus explained that his power indeed required 1,000 calories per hour. Hearing this made Ernest happy because she wouldn't need to bother exercising. However, there was a great danger. If the calories in her body were depleted, Ernest would lose control and become ferocious. When that happened, Blade was forced to use his power. Although it was just a blast of wind pressure, his attack was enough to injure Ernest and return her to normal. Unfortunately, even though her body returned to its original state, Ernest's gluttonous nature had not disappeared. She still often overate, making her body fat again. Blade was undergoing a routine checkup. The results showed that his physical condition was improving, but there were still limitations. If he used more than 30% of his original strength, his life could be in danger. One day, while walking in the hallway, Blade met Maria, a clumsy girl who suddenly asked him to kill her dad initially. Blade was shocked, but then Maria explained that she was not an ordinary human, but rather a descendant of a demon. She was struggling to control the creature within her, and if she ever truly went on a rampage, she wanted Blade to be the one to end her life. Hearing that, Blade immediately accepted her request. However, he was not alone. His friends were also adamant about helping Maria. As evening approached, they prepared a training area with a protective barrier. Maria was still hesitant to release her power, but Blade assured her that she was not alone. Ernest added that they were all trustworthy, just like she herself had once lost control. Slowly, Maria resolved herself and began to unleash everything, one by one. However, the power was too immense. Instead, Maria completely transformed into a terrifying demonic figure. Ernest charged forward first, but she was sent flying far away by just a gust of wind. Sophie tried to lock it down with gravity while Ku attacked with a blast of fire. Unfortunately, the demon absorbed the flames and immediately returned them. Blade stared sharply. He advanced without even drawing his sword from its scabbard, which angered the demon as it felt looked down upon. A fierce battle ensued until Blade's sword was shattered by a barrage of attacks and demonic fire. In this critical situation, Ernest gave him her sword. With firm resolve, Blade channeled his power into the blade. The demon tried to protect itself with a protective spell. However, Blade's attack pierced through it, causing a massive explosion. The demonic figure fell, while Blade lost consciousness from exerting too much energy. He later woke up in the infirmary, held tightly by the crying doctor who was worried because Blade had been on the brink of death. After that, the situation gradually improved. The demonic entity that emerged from Maria was now called Mao. It was not Maria, even though it inhabited the same body. The king explained that Maria was the child of the demon king, born from a human womb. Her mother had passed away long ago. Nevertheless, the king allowed Maria to remain at school because Mao was also starting to get used to life at the academy and even grew to like her school uniform. However, Maria felt anxious because Maria had not appeared since Mao took over her body. She was deeply worried that Maria would disappear forever. One night, Mao asked Blade out on a date on the rooftop. Although she still held a desire to kill Blade, Mao now also showed an interest in him and wanted to make him her partner. Unfortunately, neither Blade nor Mao understood such feelings. Meanwhile, deep within herself, Maria was in deep despair. Since childhood, she had been feared by people. Only her mother had always cared for her. After her mother's death, Maria felt alone and blamed the father she had never known. This secret began to unravel when they researched Maria's pendant. It turned out the pendant was not a seal, but a container holding a message. With Mao's permission, the pendant was opened, revealing the image of the Demon King conveying his last words from Maria's mother. Behind his cruel nature, it turned out he had loved his wife and child deeply. Hearing this, Maria finally rose up and, for the first time, she confronted herself. Blade and his friends were out walking when they encountered a centaur. Blade immediately recognized her. It was Dion, his former teammate from his days as a hero. Dion almost revealed Blade's true identity, but Blade quickly diverted everyone's attention to a stuck cargo under the bridge. The next day, Dion officially became an instructor at the Hero Academy. All the students were in awe of her, as Dion was the strongest general, capable of even destroying the Iron Goddess. Blade's friends grew curious about their relationship. Dion tried to cover it up, only mentioning that they had met when Blade was 5 years old and had bitten her ass, mistaking him for a horse. He also reminisced about their battles alongside the hero, though she expressed regret at not being able to accompany the hero in the fight against the Demon King. On a different day, a giant bird was seen flying across the sky. At first, it seemed harmless, but upon spotting the cargo, it suddenly went berserk. Blade grew suspicious after noticing Dion carrying a large, suspicious cargo. It turned out to contain an egg. The king later explained that the mother bird was unable to build a proper nest, so he decided to help hatch the egg. There were two conditions for the egg to hatch: it had to be placed at the same height as the sacred tree and exposed to the sunset light at exactly the right time. Therefore, the advanced class students were given a mission to distract the bird until the egg reached the suitable location. A battle ensued between the students and the bird. Despite their best efforts, the bird was too powerful to control. Even Ku, who was a dragon, was overwhelmed. Ernest, in her Asmodeus form, was also defeated by it. As sunset approached, the bird became aware of its egg's presence. The students asked Blade to carry the egg to the tower peak alone. Though hesitant at first, his friends convinced him to trust them with the battle. Dion helped Blade carry the large egg to the top. The king was waiting to congratulate them, but when another bird approached, it was revealed that the king owed a debt to the bird and now wanted to repay it by protecting their egg. Blade was furious that the king hadn't been honest from the beginning, so much so that he punched him away. Sophie stopped time, giving Blade a chance to unleash his power and knock the bird unconscious. Moments later, the large egg hatched, and a pair of chicks were born. As soon as they opened their eyes, they looked toward Blade and regarded him as their parent. Overjoyed, Blade flew together with the young birds. This situation made Blade happy, as he had gained new friends once again. The king introduced a virtual reality system for advanced class training. With this system, students could unleash their full power without worrying about injuring others. However, Blade felt uneasy. He struggled to distinguish between reality and simulation, fearing he might accidentally hurt his friends. To test them, the king changed the training environment and assigned various missions. In one mission, the students had to fight until only one remained. The winner would receive the privilege of unrestricted use of the VR system. The battle began. Ernest, who was usually composed, now appeared bloodthirsty. He held nothing back and made Blade his primary target. With a fierce expression, he began approaching him. But Blade remained calm. He confronted him and unleashed a swift wind technique that defeated Ernest before he could even attack. In the end, Blade was the last one standing as the winner. Despite this, the students disliked the king's idea this time. Blade used the VR device to punish the king. Meanwhile, the atmosphere at the academy shifted slightly. Clay and Kasim looked gloomy. They had lost to Jessica and Korea not only in strength but also in pride. The defeat felt heavier because both had feelings for their opponents. It turned out Clay liked Jessica, while Kasim liked Korea. On the other hand, the female students gathered together. Jessica and Korea were unsure how to cheer up Clay and Kasim. At first, they considered having a rematch and pretending to lose. But they realized that would only make things worse. Clay and Kasim eventually resolved to train harder. They sought direct guidance from Blade to improve their skills. With renewed determination, they practiced day and night. On the day of the rematch, Clay and Kasim promised themselves that if they won, they would confess their feelings. The match was intense. Initially, they dominated, but the situation quickly turned. Jessica unleashed fire from her fan, while Korea reinforced her hammer by increasing its mass. The attack shattered Kasim's avatar first. Clay fought on alone. However, Jessica launched relentless attacks until he, too, was defeated. Despite this, Clay smiled and accepted the loss. In the end, they all shook hands sportingly. One day, the school was visited by a mysterious robot that shocked all the students. Instead of being scared, the students found the robot adorable. However, its purpose for coming was no joke. The robot had come to find Blade. Unlike his friends, Blade felt disturbed. Without hesitation, he attacked the robot, smashing it to pieces. Ernest was furious, thinking Blade was too cruel to a seemingly helpless robot. However, Blade explained that it was no ordinary machine, it was a guardian, the protector of the king's secret library. Even though Blade destroyed it multiple times, the robot always returned to its original form. Ernest eventually restrained Blade to prevent him from attacking again. But from its own admission, the robot's mission was indeed to target Blade. Korra approached gently, trying to do something and befriend it. Despite being threatened with destruction, Korra extended a hand and named it Iona. Gradually, Iona revealed the real reason it was looking for Blade. Blade often entered the restricted zone it guarded, the king's library. Although Blade had a master key, he lacked biometric authentication or genetic code clearance. Therefore, every time he broke in, Iona always tried to stop him. The students then tried to find a way to defeat the Guardian. They discovered that Iona's soul was stored outside its robot body, which was why it could resurrect even after being destroyed repeatedly. To weaken it, they had to return its soul to its body. In a one-on-one duel, Iona itself revealed its weakness to Blade. It fought with all its might, while Blade held back from using his full strength. Eventually, Blade lost the fight, and all the students cheered for Iona's victory. However, after the battle, Iona seemed downcast. During the fight, it had severed its connection with the mother computer, the central server that controlled it. When it tried to reconnect, its access was denied. Without central control, Iona lost its purpose in life. It then begged Blade to become its master and threatened to attack anyone if its request was refused. Blade had no choice but to accept. Iona's presence made Chape jealous. It felt that its position had been replaced by Iona. The two then competed to prove who was most worthy of being by Blade's side. But over time, Chape and Iona began to understand each other. Both had known loneliness, and meeting Blade had made their worlds more colorful. Sharing these feelings, they eventually became friends. Unfortunately, making Blade its master only slowed down Iona's self-destruction process. As a final request, it wanted to enjoy its last days with its friends. The students held a special party for it. Then, the day of parting arrived. But the feared explosion never came. While everyone was confused, Blade emerged from underground. It turned out he had found the mother computer and persuaded it not to destroy Iona. Hearing this, Iona cried tears of relief and hugged Blade tightly. That day, the students trained as usual. And as expected, Blade was always the winner. Seeing this, Leonard felt his pride was hurt. He mustered all his strength to fight Blade, but still lost easily. Refusing to give up, Leonard then gathered his friends and formed the Super Creature Suppression Committee, a special plan to take down Blade. The first attempt was made by Ernest. Full of confidence, he attacked Blade with Leonard's spear. But Ernest was defeated instantly. Even Leonard's spear was shattered in an instant. The second attempt was Yes's turn. He tried to attack Blade while he was asleep. Unfortunately, the effort failed completely because Iona swiftly protected her master. Leonard finally stepped in. However, before he could even fight, his weapon had already been damaged from Ernest's previous duel. Not giving up, Maria tried to step forward to take him down. But Mao couldn't control his killing urge and ended up ruining their plan. Blade responded casually. Soapy tried a different strategy. He attempted to attack Blade's eyes. But easily, Blade blocked his face with one hand. Korea then charged forward with his axe. But because he was reckless, he ended up tripping over Blade's own foot and falling. After all methods failed, the committee group began to change their target. They no longer wanted to defeat Blade but merely make him surrender, like when he faced Iona before. For that, Leonard, Clay, and Kasim disguised themselves as criminals and tried to take a teacher hostage. At first, the teacher didn't realize their plan. Instead of panicking, the teacher asked Blade for help with a sweet expression. This surprised the female students, who even competed to be taken hostage. The teacher then chose to step back and advised them to live their youth without him. Meanwhile, Blade was confused. He had no idea what hostage meant or why his friends wanted to be taken hostage. When he asked me, the answer was hilarious. According to him, hostage was a type of food that wasn't easily destroyed. This made Blade even more puzzled as to why they wanted to turn him into food when it was clearly forbidden. Not only that, Blade already knew who was behind the criminal masks. However, Leonard continued his act by taking Ernest hostage. Blade, who had let his guard down, finally used a special technique with his sword, a penetrating wind slash that instantly destroyed their weapons and clothes. In this situation, they had no choice but to attack together. But as usual, they were all still defeated by Blade, who didn't even take them seriously. One day, Blade and Ernest witnessed a female student celebrating her birthday with her friends. Blade was confused. He didn't understand what a birthday was and didn't even know the date of his own birth. This prompted a discussion among the female students. They wanted to celebrate Blade's birthday but had no idea what to give him as a gift. The only information they had was one simple fact: Blade absolutely loved carton katsu. King then proposed a unique idea. For his birthday gift, they would create a special dish. He took the entire advanced class into a special training mission with one condition: they could not leave until they had collectively consumed 11.3 billion calories. This was no simple meal, as the ingredients they had to gather were ferocious live monsters. Although Blade initially thought it was too difficult, Ernest's encouragement motivated the students to proceed. They successfully hunted the monsters, trapped them, and brought the ingredients back to be cooked. Watching everyone's enthusiasm, Blade fell silent, observing how the students worked together seamlessly and even seemed happy in their tasks. Later, while bathing in the hot springs, Blade reflected that this exhaustion was actually beneficial. Curious about Blade's childhood, Ernest asked him directly. Blade gave a simple answer: from a young age, he lived in a dangerous wilderness, forced to choose between becoming strong or losing his life. The next day, King decided the initial test was too easy and changed the rules. Now, the students had to gather special ingredients for the curry recipe, each with its own unique challenge. A cabbage monster that Ernest was forbidden to burn, corn that had to be defeated using boxing techniques, carrots that would let out a deafening scream and spread a curse when pulled. Despite the challenges, all the students cooperated, facing each obstacle while maintaining their cheerful spirit. That evening, in a festive atmosphere, King announced their mission to reduce the forest monster population was a success. Only the final task remained: hunting the Beast King to serve as the curry's main meat. But before they could move, a giant monster appeared and devoured Bisking in one gulp. King immediately changed their target. Kenny would now have to fight the behemoth, a far larger and more powerful monster. A fierce battle ensued, but the students' relentless attacks had no effect on the behemoth. As the monster rampages, Leonard quickly provided protection. Blade joined forces with Mao, though he was still restricted to using only 15% of his power. Meanwhile, Iona and Sophie distracted the monster to give Blade time to prepare a final attack. Finally, they combined their powers to form a giant sword, which cleaved the enemy in two, ending the battle in victory. Overwhelmed with exhaustion, Blade immediately fell into a deep sleep. After the battle, the healing teacher examined Blade. Thanks to his nutritious diet and physical training, he could now access 18% of his power. The next day, Blade went to the cafeteria as usual, only to be met with a huge surprise: his friends had organized a birthday party for him. Having never celebrated before, Blade was unsure how to react. They then presented their best gift, the special curry, cooked from the ingredients they had fought for during the trials. As he tasted it, Blade fell silent. It was incredibly delicious, more than anything he had ever eaten. For the first time, he was genuinely touched, realizing the dish was a true symbol of his friendship with them. Clay practiced according to Blade's instructions. Suddenly, someone resembling Shape appeared and perfectly mimicked the move. However, the real Shape soon arrived and protected Blade from the attack. Noticing the presence of others, the Shape duplicate quickly left. Before long, its identity was revealed: it was Uni, one of the 5 duplicates of Shape. They were not only spies but also had an assassination mission. Meanwhile, a young girl named Eliza was testing a device designed to store fighting spirit or power. Shortly after, another duplicate named Quarte appeared. From the moment she arrived, she made strange requests, such as asking to be taught how to make a baby. But the innocent Blade did not understand what she meant. Quarte then launched a fierce attack but still failed to kill him. After that, the real Shape arrived. It was then that they realized the duplicate's main target was Blade's life. Sophie vowed to protect him. On the other side, the shoppy duplicates and a scientist continued to plot Blade's assassination. That night, as Blade slept, Sophie approached him. Yona, who was on guard, immediately became wary because she did not recognize Sophie's aura. However, Sophie only wanted to check on Blade's condition before heading into battle. She tried to negotiate with Uni but failed, as the order to kill the hero could not be disobeyed. In their duel, Uni lost to her, but Sophie still could not bring herself to finish Uni off. The next day, Sync attempted to kill Blade in a virtual reality simulation. He even managed to make Blade die in the simulation. However, after regaining consciousness, Sync became enraged and went on a rampage, chasing Blade while destroying everything around him. Blade ran toward another academy building, where Ernest's team was ready to intercept. Unfortunately, their strength was not enough to stop Sync and Do. Just as Ernest was about to be attacked, Blade appeared at high speed to protect him. Sync and Do then combined their powers to create a black hole capable of absorbing anything. Ernest's team was nearly pulled in, but Bed struggled desperately to save them from being sucked in. At the critical moment, Sophie arrived and used her own black hole power to swallow the opponent's artificial black hole. In the end, the battle concluded with the defeat of Sync and Do, who were quickly taken away by another duplicate. When she came to, Sophie felt pity. She wanted to save the duplicates, who shared the same fate as her. Blade also shared the same desire. Unfortunately, the duplicates' bodies had been modified, making them difficult to persuade. They could not refuse orders, and their lives would not last much longer. Sophie decided to leave the Hero Academy. Even the king couldn't stop her, as he had no right to detain her. Sophie's departure upset Ernest deeply, but Blade tried to calm him down. Blade and his friends resolved to find Sophie. When they met, Sophie asked them to let her go. However, after some persuasion, she finally revealed her secret: she was a modified human created to surpass the hero. Sophie felt she didn't deserve happiness because she was merely an artificial human. Still, she was glad to have been friends with them and was willing to protect everyone, even if it meant sacrificing her life. Ernest gently patted Sophie's head and scolded her for having such foolish thoughts. He told her that if she was happy with her friends, she should continue living with them. They then began devising a plan to help Sophie. However, Blade refused to kill anyone. Even though it seemed impossible to stop the duplicates without killing, he held firm to his principles. Eventually, the 5 Sophie duplicates received a challenge letter from Blade. The battle was orchestrated by Eliza with one goal: to drain their energy. During the duel, Blade only defended against all attacks while his friends helped by channeling their fighting spirit into his sword. Slowly, the tide turned. One by one, the Sophie duplicates exhausted their energy until only one remained. At sunset, the last duplicate was struck by Blade's attack without putting up much resistance. It turned out their lifespans were already nearing their end. Unfortunately, the investigation at their headquarters yielded no results. The scientists who created them had died, and there was no kill order as they had believed. The duplicates were on the verge of death. Sophie then asked for all her duplicate sisters to be gathered and offered them a way to survive. However, the duplicates refused, feeling their purpose had ended. Blade refused to give up. He wanted them not just to survive but to live beyond their strength. That reason was enough to give the duplicates new hope. In the end, Sophie gathered their souls into her own body so they could stay together and live longer. Days returned to normal, and all the students continued their training. However, their strength was still no match for the hero, who lived among them as an ordinary student.